I left Puerto Lindo bright and early on the morning of the 6th of April to start my 1-hour leisurely drive to the port of Cologne. For some unknown reason, the ferry people had requested that all vehicles be there at 8 in the morning, even though the ferry doesn't leave until 7 at night. But since riding around in the coolness of the early morning is much more enjoyable than any other time during the day, I didn't really mind. Along the way, I found that a week later, someone had finally flipped the excavator back over. I also discovered that much like many other forms of wildlife, the bling buses are more active in the morning, and there's nothing like a few good rolling masterpieces to distract your mind from an upcoming day full of paperwork and waiting. I pulled into Cologne expecting the absolute worst from all the things I've heard about this city, but it really didn't seem so bad. I'm not saying I'd like to build a summer house there, but the trees were actually quite lovely. I pulled up to the waterfront, and for the first time the hulking form of the ferry made itself apparent. This boat is monstrous. It's really more like a floating hotel than anything else. Not a very good hotel, mind you, but at least it has a parking lot. When I pulled up, I found that most of my overland traveling friends were already there, and sometime after 9 o'clock we finally began the ridiculous paper shuffling process. We were required to make $10 worth of copies of all of our important documents, and separate everything into 5 different piles, all while standing outside amongst the stiff ocean breeze that was coming off the Caribbean. And then we waited, and waited, and baked in the sun. Fortunately for us motorcyclists, our German friends know how to travel in style. They offered us coffee and a shady place to sit, things that are absolute necessities in the overwhelming heat of a tropical parking lot. Several hours later, we started the boarding process, standing in lines mostly and waiting for our paperwork. And then finally, we were told we could bring our vehicles around and prepare to board the ferry. Boarding was a relatively simple process, even though the cruise ship dock in Cologne was not designed with the stern-loading ferry in mind. Someone had the bright idea to pull up a barge behind the ferry so that the stern ramps could still be used. Upon entering the ferry, I was struck with the thought that it's kind of odd that I was driving my vehicle into another vehicle that was so large the other motorcyclists and I could have used it as a racetrack. And the largeness of the interior space of this vehicle was accentuated by how empty it was. Even after all the vehicles were on board, it was still less than a quarter full, which is probably one of the reasons the ferry is going out of business. In fact, the general consensus of just about anybody you can talk to is that this boat is just too big for the job. Once on board, I breathed a huge sigh of relief, and the Yankee and I celebrated with a victory beer. We knew now that nothing short of a catastrophe would keep us out of South America. But our spirits were dampened a bit over the next 3 hours as the boat went nowhere. After traveling for over 3 months on my own schedule, it's hard for me to describe how frustrating I found it to suddenly find myself pinned to someone else's schedule. And so, completely helpless and bursting at the seams with excitement, I watched and waited as the last few vehicles were loaded onto the ferry. Somewhere around an hour after the sun went down, the ramp finally came up, and the exhaust stacks started to belch great clouds of smoke into the sky. And then, imperceptibly at first, our giant floating hotel started to move away from the dock. And then it started to move quite quickly, much quicker than you would think anything so big could possibly move. And then a couple hours later, the lights of Cologne had disappeared over the horizon, and I was fast asleep. After a frigid night spent in what amounted to an airplane seat, I woke to sun streaming through the windows, and I figured since it was light I might as well go explore a bit. I took my GPS out on deck to mark a waypoint out in the middle of the ocean, and found that we were moving at a fairly steady 30 kilometers an hour, and we were about halfway there. Despite the ship's large size, the swells moved it around quite a bit, and at times it was even difficult to walk. Every once in a while the boat would hit an offbeat wave and jolt a couple centimeters in some random direction. For me, this served as a stern reminder of the awesome power of the ocean, that this giant floating hotel with its mobile racetrack underneath could be picked up and moved around as if it was a child's toy. For me, this was all great fun, because fortunately I don't suffer from motion sickness. But there were certainly others among the passengers who did not appear to be enjoying the choppy seas as much as I was. During my explorations, I found a full schematic of the ship in one of the stairwells, on which there was a room marked simply, "Cold Beer Storage." Unfortunately, I could not locate it in real life. Eventually, Colombia appeared as a thin, brownish strip along the horizon, and shortly thereafter, the harbor pilot came aboard our ship. In most harbors and potentially tricky waters of the world, the authorities require that you let someone on board to steer for you who knows those waters well. Presumably, this is to avoid smashing very expensive boats into very expensive docks. After executing a 180-degree turn, our giant floating hotel leaned in and kissed the dock. We had arrived in Cartagena. We disembarked into the brilliant sunshine of a beautiful South American afternoon, ready to hit the road and explore a new continent. After we fill out all the necessary paperwork, of course. which was actually a refreshingly straightforward and quick process. After the confusing cluster muster that characterizes the Central American border crossing, I wanted to reach out and hug the Colombian officials for making things so easy. And there was a small part of me that felt sorry for all of these poor motorcyclists on their way north to Central America. After the paperwork, I made my way to the old town and found a hostel for the night. And then in the morning, I went in search of a mechanic where I could get new rear brake pads for my motorcycle. I found what I needed at the first place where I stopped. Everyone there was super helpful, and I would highly recommend them to anyone who's traveling through Cartagena. I'll leave the coordinates to their shop in the description of this video, just in case. On my way back to the old town, I started to get a feel for the hectic traffic of Cartagena. In some places, the streets are one way, 4 lanes going the same direction, and all divided. Things can get pretty challenging when you suddenly realize you need to be making a turn from the far lane. I quickly decided it would be best to take the motorcycle back to the parking lot and continue on foot from there to wherever I want to go. Fortunately for me, the historic downtown is highly walkable and full of all sorts of interesting things. There's old forts with lots of cannons, and street vendors with lots of delicious food. So I've been collecting patches from all of the countries I visited. So far Honduras has eluded me. I finally found it, but it's taken me all the way to Colombia. And during my search, I just happened to randomly find a Kawasaki patch too, which is pretty cool. I might put that on my riding jacket. There's also a good amount of spectacular artwork all over this city. It seems like every crumbling wall is fair game to be used as a canvas. And in one of the plazas, there was a great metal sculpture installation depicting scenes from the daily life of people of the city. For dinner, I found a street vendor selling hamburgers of epic proportions. I found it to be extremely messy, extremely delicious, and extremely satisfying. And now, having sampled a decent amount of what Cartagena has to offer, I'm ready to move on in the morning. That's all for now. As usual, thanks for your support and encouragement, and if you have any questions or comments, please let me know. I'll see you guys next time.